Okay, there we go. Hi, this is VN Alexander. I am interviewing Teresa Coraggio today, who wrote this fantastic book called How to Dismantle an Empire, which is a how-to book. And I can't think of a better project for all Americans today. And I'm sure everybody wants to know. And she doesn't say how to overthrow an empire or how to overthrow a country. You notice that? Dismantle an empire. We're not supposed to be an empire. So Teresa, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tori. This is wonderful.
And just tell me a little bit about how who you are and how you got interested in this topic.
So I'm on this topic entirely an autodidact, I think is how you pronounce that, that I was getting my doctorate in the psychology of creativity and then went into business and by accident and then ended up as a mom and a housewife and saying, how did we get into this mess? This is not the kind of world that I want my daughters to inherit. And so that got me into this long search for the origins of where things have gone so wrong. And that was in writing this book, I would say at least a 15-year journey of research. And I had a radio show for a while, and that gave me the confidence that I was saying something people would want to hear. So then I spent maybe 7 years researching this book.
That shows there's so much research that went into this book. And I just want to point out too, we're very, very similar in a lot of ways. And I was doing my PhD in the philosophy of creativity and intentionality. But I wasn't really very political. And when I became a mom, I was radicalized into politics. And here we are.
Yes. And you are the first woman to interview me about my book and mom. And that's so significant because as I say on my Substack, what I'm doing is a mother's view of economics.
Listen, women, housewives, otherwise known as domestic engineers, run a kind of economy that's closer to a political or governmental economy because a government is not a business. It is not your objective to expand as much as you can and get in as much revenue as you possibly can and hire as many people as you possibly can. It's run, more like a nonprofit, and a household is run with the good of the welfare of your family members priority, and
Yes.
also with a long term generational view. What better perspective is there than this perspective of a mother for running the country, not a businessman?
Yes. No, I say that specifically in my Substack. I have one episode where I talk about how I started this as the word economia means management of the household. And what we do as mothers is organize labor
Mm-hmm.
because you want your kids to flourish, but shit's got to get done. And so being able to make sure that things are fair, that there is a way, that there's reciprocity, that it's not just one way from parent to kid, but kids are showing that reciprocity and being an asset to the household. That those are things that are so important. And I was at my wit's end raising three girls. And when my oldest, the one I mentioned as Veronica, who often gets called Victoria, that when she was in second grade, something happened where I said, oh my God, I'm raising a brat. That she just was not listening to me. Her peer group was who she was looking to please. And I decided that I had to stop working entirely because at that point I was still working part time and contract, and that I devoted myself, I say, to making her life miserable.
So you're homeschooling?
Sorry?
Did you start homeschooling?
I didn't, well, so we live a half block from the high school, a block and a half from the middle school, a couple blocks from the elementary school. I would have had to feel that my kids' lives were in danger for me to not take advantage of the fact that I had that time. But what I ended up doing was actually homeschooling after they left school. So I had a pretty intensive program of global education and music practice and workbooks and things like that. But it, as they got older especially, it was really focused on me exposing them to different podcasts and videos and things that they read, and then they earned points, and their points that they earned ended up having a different value depending on how they spent them. So if they were spending them on junk, it was $1 a point. If they were spending them on books, they got more. If it was fair trade clothing, they got more. If it was donations to charity, they got, the most of all. But everything that they had, they were earning in some sense, typically by 15 minutes of, something. And then that often included, they could double their points if they were also doing something useful around the house, like painting or gardening at the same time that they were listening to these things. And it gave us such a different rapport. And they ended up getting, especially my middle daughter, well, and the oldest, got their friends involved, so that we ended up putting on events for global charities where they would research them, and then I would cook, they would end up serving, and then they would talk about whatever the cause was that they had chosen for that time. And that became such a neighborhood event. So so what I do with my carrot system, to be honest, is just scale that up.
Okay,
Where,
just to let the listeners understand. So the carrot system is kind of an alternative currency that we'll start talking about in just a minute. But
yeah,
that is this outgrowth of your monetary theory of how best to handle an organized labor and a community. And so that's the carrot.
exactly. Yes. And that I don't think anyone is qualified to be able to say how that we should run a community unless they have proven first that they can run a household and raise children who are an asset to that household, not ones who are just going off to soccer practice and, whatever else, and you're doing all the work. We need ones who know how to wash dishes, clean toilets. They need to be functional.
And self-taught in a way that you teach them how to teach themselves. One of the
Yes.
unintended consequences of public education is that parents now think that they don't have to be involved in the education of their kids. They assume that whatever's going on at the school, that somebody else is taking care of that. But of course, that doesn't work out. Sometimes it could. It just really depends on the school and the teacher. So, and it is, learning is lifelong, and if you're not involved in that process with your kids, um, they're not going to get as much out of childhood as they possibly could. And a lot of the things that you're saying, we have a farm, and I homeschooled my son after third grade, and we'd watch history documentaries while doing chores around the house, preserving food, preparing food, and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's even more insidious than just that the schools aren't doing their job, that there is a campaign, an agenda that parents don't matter, that parents are trying to hold you down, that they don't have anything to teach you. And so I would not do anything differently because my daughter's friends say your home provided a place for us to be able to experience what it felt like to have, that somebody called us the weirdest normal family they've ever met. But I hope the next generation will homeschool, and my daughter's husband was homeschooled. And I think that that's why
But
he is so industrious and so curious. He just is someone who loves learning, and that gets drilled
yeah,
out of
yes,
his.
it really does. And I think a lot of people say to me that, oh, this parent is not qualified to educate their child. You and I have a lot of education, so maybe we were better at it. But then again, is that parent a product of the public school system? Ah, I think I've identified the problem. So,
Right.
and I
Yes.
not, I think education is absolutely one of the most important things that in this country today, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the way we've been doing it is the best way. I do think there should be community learning centers that facilitate lifelong learning, and families can get involved. And as you say in your book, quite often, little different communities can choose different solutions for their particular needs, and there is no one plan that's going to fit for everybody. So what worked for mothers like you and me may not work for other people. And I did. My son wanted to go back to school in high school just to take chemistry because it was getting dangerous having a chemistry lab in our house. So he went back just for chemistry. So, and, it's great for the school to be there for that. It's not all or nothing. Um,
Yes.
but let me start talking about your book now. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of research here in describing all the kinds of corruptions in the perverse financial vehicles that have just destroyed the middle class, created this wealth disparity, has enslaved people, debt slaves, tax slaves, um, and I want to acknowledge all that, but I want to go to your solution because you convinced me that you know what you're talking about when you go through all this history. But what I'm interested right now is your particular solution to the problem. We've already mentioned the carrot system. Let me just pull up my notes.
And I can start by explaining that, trying to capsulize it as much as possible. That one of the things that I look at the very beginning in my book is what is our purpose? And I believe that our purpose on this plane is to care for the people and the places that have been entrusted to us. So when I look at what is the system, the economic system that we have, what it should be doing is enabling us to take care of our homes, our communities, the wildlife, the land that we are on, and also, of course, the people, and that every generation should be able to add more
You
to what the family assets.
you
They should
you
never
you
be going
stress
backwards.
self-sufficiency so much, and a
Mhm.
good government would not get in the way of people being self-sufficient. Right now, with people paying so much in property taxes for middle class people with just small houses or whatever, they pay a lot in property taxes. That puts their home in danger, their one asset, their shelter, um, and so I think government should never do anything that gets in the way of self-sufficiency. And and then we had the lockdown where people weren't allowed to buy seeds. everyone was thinking, holy shit, I better start a garden because I can't go to the grocery store, and people were prevented from buying seeds. So that kind of craziness is, we just have to put up with that, or are we going to allow ourselves to be self-sufficient? Um, One of the most important things that we have a lot of similarities in, I'll just say my background and how I am able to talk about these kinds of things is, as a philosopher of science, I studied complex systems. And what I learned from that is intelligence is always, the most intelligent systems are always decentralized. And the most creative systems, the most robust systems are always decentralized and to some extent self organizing. They have some hierarchies, but the hierarchies kind of shift and they come and they go and they're kind of dynamic, like the real world. Some people get into leadership roles at some point and then they get out and then they're more supportive roles at other times. And so it that my background in the philosophy of science in intelligence and creativity led me to realize that politics has to be decentralized if it's going to be intelligent. And the idea of a central bank is the dumbest thing that they could have possibly come up with. So,
Depending on your perspective, from their perspective, it was genius.
and it's so hard to convince people that we have to end the Federal Reserve and change the way we do banking in this country. The Federal Reserve creates new money out of debt. So tell us about your monetary theory. Tell about your banking theory.
Yes. So to start with just defining the problem, that I distinguish between money and wealth, that money is a way of controlling other people's labor, but wealth is a way of controlling your own. And that when they ended up creating hierarchy, going way, way back, that the reason that it's pronounced hierarchy and not hierarchy is that it's not really the inheritance of the archons, it's who they're hiring and the order in which they're hiring, because we have been made from the origin of money to be dependent on the people who have the money and are trickling it down to us. So the way in which they have usurped our labor is by usurping ownership of the houses. That when you get a mortgage, they are not taking it out of someone else's bank account. They're not taking it out of their own bank account. They're creating it out of thin air, which you could never do. Like if you were selling your house and I said, "Hey, let me make up some numbers and put them in, in some account for you and you can then spend it." That would never work. And
So
and
yeah,
then you would
you
end
would
up
have to give me an IOU for my house, and then I would have to be able to sell that IOU to somebody else for goods or whatever. That would be the equivalent, which would be kind of hard to do. But I think,
exactly.
yeah,
Yes. And so by them usurping ownership of the houses, our labor goes to them for the next 30 years. And that means that all of that money, what the money that represents stored labor, ends up getting kind of greenwashed, where it goes up to them, and then it's seen as valid, and so then it trickles back down. But they have the power to take away your house at any time because they create the money that we all depend on, and
can I just jump in here
money.
for the difference between money and wealth for our listeners? Money is the currency, some sort of paper IOU that is seen as legal tender that people value and will trade with. And wealth is actual things that have inherent value, like land, like a house, and so forth. And so, as long as a civilization or communities is owns their own wealth, and has control of their own wealth, they are wealthy. But the minute that you introduce a currency, you introduce the possibility that people will use that currency in a way to drain money from your community and to, for one, take the interest off the mortgage. And does that is that an okay explanation, or do you want to qualify that somewhat?
Let me add to that that money is a means of organizing labor in the interest of whoever creates it.
Yes.
So that having the rich, the wealthiest people on the planet, create the money means that all of our labor is really spent making the rich richer. That is the only job in town. That either you're serving them directly or you are being a servant to the people who do serve them.
And if you
If
look
our
at the money supply and the wealth disparity from 1913 when the Federal Reserve was created, clearly they created a bunch of money and gave it to themselves. You know, the lower and middle class kind of stayed about right here with as much money, and there's this huge creation of new wealth that went up. You wonder, you know, there's so many billionaires. Where'd all that money come from? It wasn't in circulation before. They just created it and
exactly.
gave it to the billionaires. So who
Yes.
should who
Well, actually, though, if I can clarify, if they were to just create the money and give it to themselves, it wouldn't serve their purpose. That what they need to do is create the money and have us back it with our labor before it goes back to them as mortgage payments. Because at that point, it becomes equal to the money that you earn with your hard-earned labor. So that part of the trick has to happen. So 94% of the money in circulation is created by mortgages. And that is usurping ownership of the houses so that if you have a roof over your head, in some way you are serving them.
um, and just to point out to people who are not aware, when a bank loans somebody the money for that mortgage, they just write that on the books. This is they're not taking money that they have on deposit from somebody else. They are just creating that money, and as you pay back the mortgage, it's uncreated. So this is all just made up, and they have no right to your labor or to your home if you should default on your loan. Um, and so, in hoping that people default is one way that they acquire more of this wealth from the middle class and from the poor too. So it's diabolical. Now it doesn't. Now who should be creating? What entity should be creating the money then, given what we've just said?
Exactly. So what I say is that money is not evil. It's who is creating it. That the idea that that your labor should do something to pay back the previous generation who created the house or pass on the gift to the next generation, that having a debt in order to move into a home that someone else built with infrastructure that another generation, that's a real thing. But it's not the bankers who ever lifted up a hammer to build that house. So having the community be the default owner so that when property changes hands, that they are the ones who are issuing the credit, who are issuing the debt in order to buy that house. That's what my system does, because the then that gets to the next part, which is the carrot system, is that then I not only create the debt, but I also on a monthly basis create the credit to repay the debt. And that gets distributed to all members of the commonwealth is what I call it for the larger entity.
for the community. And let me just ask a couple of questions on this. Now, do you think, what do you say to people who, this is part one of the question, what do you say to people that want to just reform, think that you can reform or audit the Federal Reserve, the centralized banking, that you just need good people? If you didn't have evil people, is that possible to, get a good Federal Reserve chair in there?
I think you're voicing what 90% of the arguments that I have are about,
Yeah.
as I think you know, is that my book could be subtitled "Give Up Hope, All Ye Who Enter Here," because what I'm showing is that this scam goes so deep, so deep. The money isn't even in the country. The money's in all these treasure islands, these offshore tax havens. You cannot give them the power of owning all of our labor and think that somehow you're going to get that back, by piece with little reforms. That to me, what we're looking for is that it is just as hard to do a little tweak to the system as it would be to change the thing that will change everything. And so I think of it as bowling, where what you're doing is to say, okay, I've got this one ball and I want to knock down as many pins as possible in the ways that they're controlling us. So what's the one thing I'm going to choose if I want to change as much as possible permanently so that it can never shift back?
Yes, yes. And the banking, how the money is created is, is the thing. Come on, people, let's stop talking about all this other stuff. They can create their own money and wield the power of that. Are we crazy for allowing that? Of course they're not going to. Okay, now my second
Yeah.
comment here, for what you've just talked about is the idea that the community bank sort of is the only one that can issue mortgages in that particular community, and then the interest for those mortgages goes back to the community in form of carrots, what you call, and the carrots can be spent into the community for things. It looks like you want to qualify that slightly. Okay.
Yes. So in my system, anyone can you could issue a mortgage for your house
Okay.
because you own it. What the private bankers cannot do under my system is make money up from thin air.
Mhm.
That that is the essential privilege of government at some form.
Mhm.
And you and I are in complete agreement that the smaller, the better. So that the smallest unit that I look at is the hamlet, a word we both like, that is just a couple thousand people, and that your locus of control is within those 2,000 people. But it's not just the interest. That if you were to pay off all the existing mortgages, you are taking 94% of all credit out of circulation. There's no money left
Right.
because that's what
Whatever's
they've.
created is uncreated as the debts are repaid. So,
Exactly, right. And that's why inflation is built in. It's baked in because typically when you get a mortgage at 5.3% interest, you're paying double. You're paying as much in interest as you are for the loan. And so in the first 15 years, the money is gone. The money it created is gone. And so there is no more money unless they figure out how to double that mortgages for everybody so that more money goes into circulation. Otherwise, the gig is up. And that's why they kind of have a problem. So when people say, oh, my house is worth so much more, I say, no, your house is not worth more. Your money is worth less because how much house it buys is now half of what it used to. So everything that you've saved from your hard-earned labor is now worth half as much. So in my system, I'm not just I'm not just giving the interest out. What I'm doing is proactively, before the mortgages are due every month, I'm putting exactly that much into circulation within that community. So there is always as much in circulation as is needed to pay the debt. And because I've made it where it is a debt to ourselves, it doesn't really matter how much or how little there is, as long as it matches that a debt to yourself is something that the more that goes in there, the more it can create exchanges within the community and create that value so that you can always create as much currency as there is debt that is being collected by you in the community.
Okay, and then that keeps the amount stable. And so some of the things that the community bank can do is build community infrastructure that everyone can use, that kind of thing.
Yes, the way that I when it, I think this is the part where it gets fun because different communities can compare different plans and you can try something out and you can say, oh, that didn't work so well. Look at this other commonwealth over here, they ended up creating a lot more. But the five categories that I look at this
They ended up
credit
creating a lot
going.
more wealth out of the money that was in circulation.
Exactly, yes. And by wealth, what I mean are exchanges that add services or goods that are locally produced. So the five categories that I look at is locally produced food and well care, which can include anything that someone else is doing that it could be child care, elder care, massage, homeopathy, anything that you are interested in. And then education, and I have a very different fun version of education that is in one of my blogs called Reinventing Education that includes edu travel and being able to go places and learn things from other people who share the same passions. And I think that is too good to be wasted on the youth and something that should be lifelong. And then the fourth is home improvements because right now, we are tapped out when you get a mortgage. You have no money left over to maintain a house. And as you know, you don't own a house, it owns you. And it always needs work. And then the fifth
And if
one
you
is
and if you're reluctant to make capital improvements like replacing your roof, we kind of talked about this offline. Uh, you pay more taxes if you put a new roof on, and you may not have been able to really afford that roof, but you couldn't afford not to put it on because you'd lose your entire asset if you don't take care of it. So this is another example of the ways in which government is currently organized to sabotage the stability of the family unit and the one asset that we have.
completely.
Hope.
Absolutely. And yes, and so my system flips that where I'm giving incentives for people to improve and maintain and expand their homes because that's what we're here for. That is every generation they should
Right.
be adding more to it. So that and then the fifth one is community improvement. And I look at that as going from the neighborhood where you have a higher percentage that would be going into that, and then all the way up to the commonwealth where there's a lot more people maybe a couple 100,000. And so it's a smaller percentage of each, but adds up so that if you want to put in, say, a health clinic, maybe you want to put in a dental school, you can do these things so that you can bring the kinds of both infrastructure and the services that you want to see in your community.
Now, so does this allow who- eh, people to come up with their own ideas of what's good for the community, or is there mob rule, what the whole community as a whole says is good, or what individuals think would be good for themselves? How do you deal with that?
Tori, that is such an excellent question. And it's one that when we are czars of our fiefdoms and we compare notes, I don't have the right answer to that. But I've thought about it that for community, it seems to me, what I've thought is that rather than having the Commonwealth or any level of government decide what people should do, that what it could do is match anything that people contribute to that on top of what the subsidy, what the credit is. And so you'd be giving incentives to people, and then you'd want to make sure that you're not letting people monopolize that. So the two things that as czar of your fiefdom you are trying to prevent is extraction and monopoly,
So those
and trying to figure
principles,
out how
those
to.
principles could help guide the decisions. Those seem like good principles. According to your book, you are inspired quite a bit with this idea of the community and home mortgages having control over the home mortgages, uh, uh, um, and from Benjamin Franklin, who everybody is familiar with the colonial script that really made Pennsylvania wealthy, a wealthy area right before the Revolutionary War. And in that system, the community city would issue the mortgage for people buying land, and then as they paid it back, the interest went into the community, or that was a way the money was created to for that mortgage, and so that by writing the script, so that was the authority, the entity that had the power of currency creation. That was the legal tender that everybody was able to use, and so you had a means of trade, IOUs, written in the official paper that allowed goods and services to be exchanged because there was a form of currency that was going around. Instead of using gold or silver, which I've always, let me interject here about this, the idea that sound money needs to be backed by gold and silver. Okay, fine, that's a good backing, it keeps it stable, but your gold is just sitting in a vault serving a symbolic purpose. It's not like a creating money to build a train system that everybody can use. That's a really valuable functional asset that then people can use and pay for. Um, Gold just sits in the vault. And yeah, you can sell it off, but if you do, you're selling off your wealth of your country. So it's really not serving that purpose of keeping the wealth in the country. And also, people who own gold mines really have an advantage in the system where everything's backed by gold, and that's where we got into this problem in the first place, according to some explanations. I don't know whether it's true or not, but the people who mined gold or had gold, the goldsmiths, would keep gold in a vault for everybody and give them a receipt for that gold. And then they figured out that they could just create a bunch of receipts with no gold to back it. And that was the birth of currency. And it's similar to what goes on today. It's kind of counterfeiting, really. You're counterfeiting those IOUs. So you took a lot of inspiration from Benjamin Franklin, really realizing that the land which is a real asset that no one can take and run off with. It's going to stay in the community. Good place to ground your wealth, I think. He realized that you could create money based on that land. And you also are really inspired by Ellen Brown, who founded the Public Banking Institute. And I volunteered for the PBI for a while too. So we have that.
Yes. So the things that I wanted to respond to in there is that yes, gold is the original fiat currency because it was not a use value. It was something that had a value that was stamped on it that was higher than its actual use value. That was how coinage came into being. So that meant that they could distribute these coins and tax people in them, and then they would have to support whatever that king or lord wanted. And so that was the first way in which our labor was usurped. Ben Franklin, I think, was such a genius, and I think his economic system was the most genius thing he ever did. He actually said, though, I had to look this up from my notes, that he said only 20% of the money in circulation should be created through debt. The other 80% should be created by government spending. So when you were talking earlier about government being able to create money for infrastructure, and of course he was the inventor of the library and the post office, and so those kinds of things that you want to have going in your community, really the 80% ended up being used often for military, but it still prevented them from having to borrow that money from a foreign country in gold, which ended up taking away the sovereignty at the end.
Can I just
So
say
yes.
government spending is another way to describe what government spending is government building assets. So just to turn it around a little bit because government spending, that's so wasteful, it just goes nowhere. If government is spending and creating money for assets that are real wealth in the community, then it's not just being spent out of existence or causing inflation or whatever. So I just wanted to say that.
Yes, I'm so glad that you get that nuance because every other day I feel like I'm seeing a meme that's like, yes, government has created inflation by creating all this money. And I keep sending things back saying, no, government doesn't even have a right to create money. That's how they've interpreted the Constitution, where it says that only government can coin, only the federal government can coin money, and that has been interpreted as change, as just quarters,
Yeah,
nickels, and
just
dimes.
the nickels and dimes and quarters, or $1 trillion coin, as the case may be. Which
Yes.
for those of you, we may not go into that, but that's something that. But I will say that we had with during Lincoln's time, we had greenbacks, which are a national currency. Initially, they were not backed by silver or gold at all, and then later they became partially backed, and there were a number of Supreme Court decisions and laws that debated whether or not that was constitutional to create greenbacks, and it was never overturned. It was upheld that that was a legitimate function of the government to create a national currency. But that just disappeared with the creation of the Federal Reserve. The question wasn't fully resolved. They just decided to let's have the banking industry create the legal tender, and so
Right.
greenbacks disappeared.
I would say the problem, though, goes back to the Constitution. That according to Franklin, the Revolutionary War was fought because of the Currency Act that forbid the colonies from issuing their own sovereign credit. And that sovereign currency was what enabled them to be free of colonization by those who held the gold back in England. And that was what Franklin said, is that gold and silver always wants to travel back, but land-backed money will stay in the community. So
Mhm.
that created it where if you have the labor and you have the need, that you can just put those two together, and you don't need to have someone else from the outside who's loaning you that amount.
And unfortunately, with the greenbacks created by Lincoln and his predecessors, it was not currency created that was backed by the land under, according to what Franklin had done. And had that been done, it would have been better. Instead, they were created just to support the war effort. And war is about the destruction of assets, literally. Yeah.
Yes,
So
yes,
that was
and
doomed
yeah, I
failure. And then
think
there was some sort of speculation going on. So many of these, whenever you're coming up with a monetary policy and theory of what money is, because it is not clear. And there are so many side effects if you create currency in this way or create it in that way. There's so many different things that could happen as it enters the economy and is used in a certain way. And so it is one of, I think, the most complicated issues that we have today. And I think that, people who are for the Federal Reserve and so forth, they want it to be like that. They want it to be very difficult to understand, and all these different weird exotic financial instruments that create all sorts of fake money, and destroy our economy. The simpler, the better. Money can be created if it's backed by land. That seems good. I would also say money could be created to build public infrastructure because it's backed by the infrastructure. That's as simple as it gets. Those are things that you can see. You don't have to open anybody's books, as you do when you're making somebody pay taxes. Now, we're vulnerable then to all sorts of abuses if we have to pay income tax, because then the IRS can look at our records and claim that we didn't do something right, and that's a felony, even if you didn't mean to make a mistake or whatever. That always can be used against us, and I think that is a power that no government should have over the people. But if currency is backed on land, backed on infrastructure, those are things that we can see, we can keep watch, um, we can monitor a little bit better. There's no problem with transparency because it's out in the open, literally.
yeah. I don't know though. I don't I because this is an issue that is very much under discussion these days with privacy, that I think of privacy as anonymity. And I don't know that anonymity is actually good. That if you have producers who are kind of in the driver's seat because they are creating this value and they may want to be deciding, well, who do I want to give this, allow to have this value? That I think that reputation is the original word for credit, that credit comes from credare, which meant that you were believable, that you
Credible.
had, yes, credible, exactly, exactly. So I think that we do want to get back to that, and that I look at the wanting to track how the carrots are being used so that you can tell, is this working? Is this something that is creating more wealth? Are there is there a way that people are extracting it from the community? And that right now, as you and I both know, our world is run by occult pedophile psychopaths. And that is the problem.
If you would have said that to me 5 years ago, I would have thought you were just crazy. But now it's like, oh my God, there might be some truth to that. Um, so So I want to say there's a slight difference. I don't know whether or not you have a legal tender in circulation that is the U.S. dollar, and then you have your carrot system as well. There's two alternative. Okay,
Yes.
So,
Parallel,
so,
both parallel.
so the lack of privacy in the carrots, because you want to trace the carrots and see how they're being traded for goods and services to make sure that they're adding to the wealth of overall wealth of the community. That is, so anybody who doesn't want to be surveilled in their purchases can use another form of currency that's outside of that. So you're not, and and perhaps the local entity issuing the carrots doesn't have any the policing powers that could then arrest you and charge you with some crime or whatever. So those are the things that I, those are that's why I'm saying that I'm afraid of taxation somewhat, and I'm afraid of loss of privacy when it comes to financial matters. I'll also say that I have been involved in locally in researching local currencies. We have something in the upstate Dutchess County area called the Current, um, which I've supported. There's also something in this area called the Common Good, and I was talking to the organizer of that. You probably have heard about it, but if I were to organize that, I would see how people were spending their credits, and I just reacted. I don't want to know what people are doing with their money. I couldn't have that. I could just I. But then again, I guess my bank knows what I do with my money more or less. So I mean that's. But whatever, whoever knows how people are exchanging their alternative currency, uh, they should not have the power to then harm those people and press charges against them for any reason. And there should be no laws that they can break. I mean, you can observe the spending the spending and the just to see how whether or not wealth is being created without the objective to try to control what people are doing.
Right. A caution though, speaking as one czar of a fiefdom to another, is that you don't want to have your mortgages be seen as a substitute for taxes or welfare or any of those things, because what you're creating is a big pot of money. If you think about all of the mortgages in your community and put them into one big pot, they will usurp it. I think it needs to have rules that say that all carrots need to be distributed equally to all native and long timers, is how I define it. That you cannot say, okay, well, government could take this amount of them because we can do this infrastructure project, or we can do this because we want to help the needy. That if you open that door a crack,
Yes.
that money's going to be gone. And that
Yes.
money needs to be only for reciprocity and building that resilience and self-reliance in the community.
Okay. Yeah, that I get that. I understand that. I had always just imagined that for instance, with a public state bank, the idea behind that is a state has a certain amount of money all the time deposited in their checking accounts in various big banks like Chase or Citibank or whatever, which then turns around and loans that money out at interest. And so the state, when the state wants to do some sort of infrastructure project, they borrow the money from those banks to do that and pay those banks interest. So it's crazy. We should have,
Yes,
any government entity should be able to use its own funds to, um, borrow from its own funds in order to build infrastructure instead of paying banks for that. Um,
absolutely,
so
100%. And yes, that what
you
I
worry that
see as
whoever's making that decision can be to build the bridge to nowhere and hire their cousins contracting companies. So, how do you solve that kind of problem?
Yes. And I think that's a great question. The way that I've imagined that could be solved is by making sure that it is the way that the colonies thought it was going to be when they turned into states after the Revolutionary War and before the Constitution, when they had the Articles of Confederation. What it said is that decisions had to be made at a small level, and they had to decide that they were going to fund it at the larger level. So all decisions got pushed down to the lowest possible level. So if we were doing that, then I think they can't decide how they're going to use that money because that money can never be taxed directly. So that's where my carrot system gives that incentive because we're creating those carrots, which means that we decide how they're going to be taxed or not taxed. And we decide what the exchange rate is going to be for whatever the imperial currency is, say the dollar. So, what we can do is say, okay, if you're spending these locally on local goods and services, there is no tax. The only thing is that it is withholding a certain amount for the pension plan, which is what we now call Social Security. And that otherwise it can keep getting exchanged as many times as possible. And that's actually what you want to have happen. I make sure that in my plan, because the first time they're issued, they cannot be, like you can't turn around and say, okay, I have these carrots. They're equal to my rent or mortgage. I'm going to turn around and use it to pay. You have to at least have one exchange because it needs to go to someone for one of those 5 different areas that I was talking about. So you have to create some form of goods and services and be providing that to your neighbors. And then if you end up having it exchange again and you do it for something that is local goods and services, again, there's no income tax, there's no sales tax, but I keep those things on the dollar because what I want to do is give local producers an advantage over foreign producers.
Your ideas would encourage people to stay put in a community and invest in the community. And I suppose some people who are more like to wander a little bit would think, oh, well, that's not right for me because I'm not investing. I'm not invested anywhere. I'm moving a lot, but I think overall, even if there are some people who want to preserve that kind of life and to be able to move and their kids move off somewhere else. Um, in general, it's good for a community if people are able to stay put and improve on their assets there and form relationships because relationships are actually part of the asset of a community. And if people are moving away and are not friends with each other and are not willing to help each other out, that you lose that reciprocity that is so important for building a niche that's healthy and an ecological environment that's healthy. Um, I have one more question. Let me see.
Could could I just interject though before that is that I think that our goal is to get rerouted and that it takes 2 generations buying homes in the same community to build those roots. And that after that, you can continue to pass down the same houses, but you don't want to have everybody living in the same house. But in order to enslave any people, you have to deracinate them, tear them up from their roots, and put them in other places. I think there's a time of life when everybody should go off and have adventures and find the place that you want to settle down and raise your kids. But if you find that place, say an 8-year investment, isn't that much if that's the place you want to be. I live in a college town, and because of the students, no one who was born here can afford to live here because and no one who works here can afford to rent because the
Yeah.
students drive that cost up. So we have this education migration that has created the idea that only losers stay at home, that if you're anybody, if you go off and you go move somewhere else and you don't want to stay in the same place. And I think that's been a trick that has created this flux where we are every generation having to buy the houses all over again.
Yes, yes, I know. Yeah, when I was young, the idea that you weren't going to have to work as hard as your parents did because they bought the house, they did all that work, but it's gone. I mean, it's gone. Usually paying for health services in the end of life. Um, what do I want? I want to say just what was I going to ask about? So in your idea that the Federal Reserve, there would be no more fractional reserve banking in the private banking industry, correct? So the
Yes.
the power of creating money would be gone, and so as you were talking about, I always think every reform, every new solution has to solve several problems and create no new ones, because usually every solution creates seven or eight new problems. And it's easy to do when you're talking about monetary policy because there are so many side effects and so many things that are difficult to control, like the idea that you're living in a college town. And living in a college town is a great thing. There's a lot of things to do. There's a lot of cultural activity involved, and it's great to have young people around. But it is harmful for the local economy for the ways that you talk about, and also the fact that there's no tax income from nonprofit educational institutions. So everything is super super complicated. But if we could just keep some things in mind, like reciprocity, adding real assets to a community, real wealth, keeping that real wealth from exiting the community, and keeping ownership in that community, then the super wealthy and other nations won't siphon off our wealth. And that's how we begin to dismantle the empire. And so a couple of moms, a couple of housewives get together and talk about ending all our problems in a single stroke. Allowing I would allow the U.S. the IRS the U.S. Treasury to issue greenbacks to then designate funds to the local areas for them to decide how to use them on public infrastructure. I would like to see that. But then after reading your book, I was like, yeah, the idea of a community bank, um, um, and the mortgages in order to keep ownership of the land, which is part of the community, that you're not making that up. That's an actual fact. To keep ownership in the community itself. Brilliant idea. Whether it's you or Benjamin Franklin, but it takes a brilliant person to recognize the genius of a past idea and try to resurrect it and get it into. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And I love that you see the difference between complicated, which you're absolutely right. They have intentionally obfuscated
Mhm.
economics by making it so complicated that we say, oh, no one can actually understand what's going on here except for the experts. And the difference between complex, because in the end, we're talking about a global economic system. And it is going to be complex, that there are going to be things that we need to think through and say, how do we foresee the reaction that's going to happen? And how can we prepare for that ahead of time? that how can we keep the rules simple so that they give the maximum amount of flexibility to individual communities, but also keep the consistency of knowing that they can't be flipped by and go back to the way things were. So I just from reading your book on the biologist mistress on systems and purpose, that I love the amount of complexity that you can hold in that head and and be able to understand so many different nuances, because I think that's where the truth is in the nuances.